So I'm a judge, but I'm a proud Jew. I am the son of a Holocaust survivor. And surprisingly, I guess we have 70 Arizonans on here. I'm the only Jewish judge in the appellate courts of Arizona. But my interest in this topic comes from a different perspective. I've always taken great pride in the accomplishments of Jews, of my people, of our rich cultural and professional contributions, whether it be Hank Greenberg, Don Rickles, Geddy Lee, or Louis Brandeis. Now, moving on, this is an impossible task. You're talking about 8 superhumans, and it's designed for hours and could last days, but I think I said to my wife and to Robert yesterday, it's kind of like the CLE version of speed dating. So before I begin, there are many books on the subject. I've read a lot of the biographies, but specifically on the Jewish judge approach. I don't know if you could see this, and I think you might have received it, but there are 2 books, and again, you should have received a cover of both. One is, it's actually only sold, well, it's now available on Amazon, but at the Supreme Court. And the other is by David Dallin, and they're both great. Okay, so who was the first Jew offered a seat on the US Supreme Court? Well, if you say Louis Brandeis, you're incorrect. It was Judah Benjamin. Now, Judah Benjamin would have preceded Brandeis by 63 years as the first member of the Jewish member of the Supreme Court, but he declined to remain in the US Senate. He is a brilliant, controversial, yet fascinating figure. The son of Sephardic Jews. He entered Yale at age 14 and was ranked first in his class when he left. Now, we all know he gained infamy, and I stress the word infamy as his nickname, the brains of the Confederacy. And in fact, he served Jefferson Davis in 3 positions in the cabinet: Attorney General, Secretary of State, and Secretary of War. He's the only Jew to appear on US currency, and a fellow senator aptly called him an Israelite with Egyptian principles. All right, so that's Judah Benjamin, but he declined. So who is it? It's one of the very, very best justices, Justice Brandeis, and he was nominated by Woodrow Wilson in 1916. He served 23 years. He had one of the most contentious confirmation battles. In fact, people say they say up until Bork in the 80s, 87, I think it was, that Brandeis's confirmation was the most contentious. Now, Brandeis didn't speak on his own behalf. They didn't do that. He didn't even appear at the Senate, but it lasted 4 months. And the other person who is sort of a finalist that really wanted that spot was former President of the United States, Taft. And when told, contacted by the press and told that Brandeis had been selected, President Taft said as follows: "This is one of the deepest wounds that I have had as an American and lover of the Constitution and believer of progressive conservative, that such a man as Brandeis can be put on the court, as I believe he is likely to be, well, a muckraker, an emotionalist for his own socialist purposes, prompted by jealousy, a hypocrite, who is utterly unscrupulous, a man of infinite cunning, of great tenacity, purpose, and in my judgment, much power of evil." Well, President Taft, I think we can't say he was prescient because, of course, Louis Brandeis went on to do great things. He was the first to hire a Jewish law clerk. He has no opinions, and talking to Robert before, I'm going to focus less on sort of the legal philosophies, but he doesn't have any opinions on the religious rights of Jews. But let's sort of take a more intimate look at him. He was born and raised in Kentucky, that Jewish bastion. Judaism was not a factor in his upbringing. He had little contact with Jewish traditions growing up, no bar mitzvah, didn't celebrate the Jewish holidays, didn't belong to a synagogue. He graduated from Harvard Law School at 20 years old in 1877 with the highest GPA in school history. And he was denied membership in most clubs because of his Judaism. Now, many of his first clients were Jewish, so you can't say he didn't have a connection. And he was a charter member of the Federation of Jewish Charities in Boston. Now, one of his favorite foods was ham. And there's a letter in his library to his 4-year-old daughter. And he's writing her from afar, and he reassures her that, quote, the Christmas tree and Santa Claus are very anxious to see you. Now, he's an attorney at this point. He's among the highest paid, really a millionaire in today's equivalent. But RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I apologize if I resort to the acronym, describes him as frugal, but philanthropic. And a friend recounted, a Jewish friend, that whenever invited to Brandeis's home for dinner, he ate before and afterward. He didn't give a lot to Jewish charities, but again, a note was, I read just yesterday in one of his biographies, they found a note handwritten from him to the Federation, offering a $175 donation in exchange for a promise, quote, of not being called upon to pass all requests which would naturally come in, most of which are no doubt very deserving. So this man, Brandeis, becomes a leading figure among Jews. And when does that happen? It happens in 2010. Sorry, 1910. And so if you look before 1910, he only gave remarks to publicly about Jews and Judaism once to a local Jewish group in 1905 to commemorate the 250th anniversary of Jews landing in America. Now, rather than discuss the struggles of Jews in their new country, foreign land, he concentrated on the duties of American citizenship. And this is fascinating, given where he went in a relatively short period. He said, first and foremost, you, new immigrants, Jews, you must discard all distinction of race and religion and become assimilated completely into your new environment. He stressed that immigrants offer their ability and intelligence to the nation, noting that Jewish people, quote, through energy, perseverance, self-restraint, and devotion, men, and I write here parenthesis, and women of Jewish blood have, wherever opportunity permitted, taken rank among the foremost in every branch of human activity. That's all he wrote before 1910. Everything changes then. Now, that's 1910, 6 years before he takes the Supreme Court. So he's still a lawyer, and he becomes an ardent Zionist. Now, biographers link it to his uncle who had passed away, and a conversation that Brandeis had with a leading Zionist who said, yeah, you know, your uncle was a big deal and meant so much to him. But whatever it was, some people say a conversion, whatever. He becomes an ardent Zionist and America's #1 preeminent Zionist leader. He immersed himself in Zionism. He was not at all concerned about how it would impact his place in society. By 1913, so this is just 3 years later, Brandeis saw Zionism as squarely aligned. And again, this is one of the most progressive minds. We have, this word progressive minds of today. This is a lion. And this progressive mind says, I see Zionism as squarely aligned with my progressive interest. Zionism is the Jewish expression of democracy and social justice. And in speech after speech in 1914 and 1915, Brandeis told Jewish audiences that his approach to Zionism came through Americanism, and the two shared common principles of social justice and democracy. He only visited Israel once with Chaim Weizmann, and I think Einstein might have been on the trip, in 1919. He was elected president. This ham-loving Jew from Kentucky of the Zionist Organization of America in 1914, and he served as president until 1921, barnstorming the country to promote Zionism, raise money, recruit new members. He became, in the words of one publication, the prophet of the Zionist cause. He became so devoted to Zionism that briefly in 1917, so 1 year after he takes the court, he considers resigning from the Supreme Court to devote himself and concentrate exclusively on Zionism. He had a critical role in the Balfour Declaration behind the scenes, getting Woodrow Wilson's support. His role ended in 1921 at the Cleveland Convention of the ZOA, again an acronym, Zionist Organization of America, when the attendees had to choose the future course of Zionism from a policy perspective. And it was kind of, do we go with political or fundraising? And they voted to go with his arch rival, Chaim Weizmann. And so he stepped down, but he remained engaged just behind the scenes. His impact on Zionism cannot be understated. Before him, American Jews in large numbers substantially opposed Zionism and the state of Israel because it, in their mind, created questions of dual loyalty and would undermine all that they have gained in American Jewry. For instance, and this is also in Brandeis's, he was shocked by this, but in his letters, he got a letter from the Union of American Hebrew Congregations in 1898, which said, quote, "We are unalterably opposed to political Zionism. America is our Zion. The mission of Israel is spiritual, not political." Okay, his burial, and I'm going to try to tell you that because I think that's important. No Jewish prayers or psalms were recited. The Kaddish was not recited. At his funeral, no rabbi officiated. Of the first 4 justices, his was the only that didn't have the Kaddish recited. His body was cremated, contrary to Arizona law. Next, let's go to Benjamin Cardozo. Number 2, President Hoover, 1932. 2 Jews on the Supreme Court. That's a big deal. Sailed, unlike Brandeis, through the Senate, unanimous vote, no floor debate. Had served, as many of us know, 18 years with distinction in New York's highest court. First Jew on that court, regarded as the greatest state court judge ever, is his at least amongst us, what he means. But anti-Semites still bemoaned that how can two Jews be on the U.S. Supreme Court? President Taft joins and he says, oh, we need to be very worried about this dangerous twosome. And we all know about Justice McReynolds, who urged Hoover not to afflict the court and the nation with another Jew, and refused in 1924 to take the portrait with the others, comparing Jews to fleas on a dog who preyed on mankind. So this was a sitting justice with two Jews. I'm sure those arguments and conferences were interesting. Brandeis had been there for 16 years when Cardozo arrives. So people will say, oh, what about their relationship? Well, there wasn't much of one. Brandeis was, I think, 14 years younger than Cardozo. He said, this is a quote, Cardozo did not like to go to Brandeis's apartment because he found it to be so overheated as to be uncomfortable. And they were different in another respect. Brandeis, well, they both looked at each other as less agile in their ability to accept alternative positions. So that's a very political way of saying closed-minded. So now he also continued hiring Jewish law clerks. He only served, crazy, he's regarded by some as the third, fourth greatest justice of all time. He only served 6 years on the US Supreme Court. Died of a massive coronary thrombosis at age 68, more than 100 opinions. Okay, now let's go back and talk about the Jewish stuff. He was born in New York to a well-known Sephardic Jewish family, descended from Spanish and Portuguese Jews who'd fled the Inquisition, and I guess before the American Revolution. He had a bar mitzvah. He was Orthodox as a kid, regularly attended Sabbath shul with his father beginning at age 5. He's the only Jewish justice to keep kosher, and he kept kosher even after joining the court, refusing shellfish and pork. He wasn't observant in his later years or even his adult years, but he always kept synagogue membership. He participated in a few communal activities. And one thing everyone always talks about when they write is he took a keen interest in a rule change at his synagogue. And he was already a judge. And the rule change was to eliminate the separate seating between men and women at the synagogue. And he showed up and he spoke in opposition, arguing that mixed seating would violate the congregation's constitution, which, quote, forbade any boy from going into the women's gallery. What was his reaction to Nazi Germany? He joined many judges in 1933 to urge President Roosevelt at the time to relax immigration restrictions for Jews that were fleeing Nazi Germany. He also criticized, this is anecdotal, maybe hearsay, but American Jews for not doing more, even burning with indignation about, for not doing more about Hitler's treatment of Jews. Here's a quote by him. "I found a man the other day who said it made him sleepless, but there are not many of his type. We need another Garrison who will cry out unceasingly until the world shall hear." But he drew the line at the courthouse steps. You have in 1935 a demonstration at a New York harbor. A big German ship, luxury liner, shows up and it's waving the Nazi flag, and Jewish demonstrators board the ship, tear down the flag, sparks a big fight. Lots of people are hurt. and many of the Jews are brought up on criminal charges, and it's a Jewish judge, a superior court judge in New York, and he dismisses all charges against the demonstrators, explaining that their reaction was normal and should have been expected. Cardozo had none of it. He was livid. He complained that the Jewish judge, quote, had let his own personal views as a Jew affect his judicial judgment, something that should never happen. He said the law was clear and the ship's owners are entitled to and were entitled to protection regardless of their origin or perspective. Let me skip ahead. His burial, Orthodox service, lasted only 10 minutes, conducted entirely in Hebrew. It consisted of the 23rd Psalm and Book of Proverbs, buried at a Jewish cemetery with his whole family, except for his sister, who had married outside the faith and was denied access against certainly Orthodox tradition. Now this seat, with his passing, becomes the Jewish seat, the first Jewish seat, because we have a progression of 4 justices that sit in the same seat. And it is, obviously, Cardozo, Frankfurter, Goldberg, and Fortas. So, number 3, Felix Frankfurter. Very, I don't know, for me, it's upsetting. But Felix Frankfurter, nominated by FDR in 1939, he was 57 years old, only Jewish justice born outside the United States. He sat for 23 years. I'll get to why, what I said earlier in a second. He actively promoted his candidacy. Unlike Cardozo, he was the first candidate to appear in front of the U.S. Senate and to testify at his confirmation. It was a bit contentious, and most of the opposition was from Jews, fellow Jews. But he passes with near unanimous support. He was, as many know, an outspoken liberal voice, founder of the ACLU, but he was a disappointment. Some call him the greatest disappointment to the left because he became the leader of the conservative wing and was a forceful advocate for judicial restraint. Yet we'll all remember his role in Brown versus Board. Now, he hired many Jewish clerks, law clerks, 18 of them in 23 years. He also hired the first Black law clerk in 1947, but not so much with females. A Harvard dean called him in 1960 and asked him if he would meet a female student ranked at the top of the class, Harvard. But Frankfurter refused, stopping the dean mid-sentence and saying, I'm just not prepared to hire a woman. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg didn't even get an interview. He was born in Vienna, a descendant from 6 generations of rabbis. He wasn't proud of his Judaism. He would often describe it as, quote, a barrier to be overcome. He regarded his Judaism as, quote, a mere accident of birth, and he passionately strove to be accepted into the elite Protestant world. Graduated Harvard, first in his class, editor-in-chief, moved to academia early, first Jewish professor at Harvard, where he remained for over 20 years. Never dated a Jewish woman, married the daughter of a Protestant minister. Cardozo officiated. Frankfurter's mother refused to attend. She said, quote, Felix has chosen a shiksa as his bride, end quote. I won't be there. His father had died. Nazi Germany, and this is what, again, I'm the son of a Holocaust survivor. It's sort of what defines me in many ways. It's in my DNA. But what is his reaction to Nazi Germany? Well, he signed that letter we just talked about, asking for relaxed immigration restrictions. How much time do we have, by the way? Because I want to make sure I get.
We have about 15 more minutes.
Okay. All right. So this is the extermination is becoming it's really mounting up, and we have the very worst years on the horizon, and a man, Jan Karski, who is a 28-year-old liaison from the Polish government in exile in London, comes to America to tell the story of what is happening. He had witnessed the atrocities and the Nazi genocide firsthand, and he was sent and came very willingly to alert political leaders in London and Washington about the dire plight of European Jews, and convinced people. I don't think people really took it seriously, this extermination, genocide, but to tell them that you better take it seriously. Well, Karski met with FDR. He wasn't terribly interested or moved, and so Karski says, who's the Jew? Who's the biggest Jew in the country? And someone says, well, Felix Frankfurter. He says, give me a meeting with Frankfurter. And so he asked to meet with Frankfurter, thinking that a prominent Jew would listen and act. And so they get in the same room, and he describes in granular detail the genocide. And Frankfurter, at the end, looks at him in the eye, and he says, a man like me talking to a man like you must be totally frank. So I say, I am unable to believe you. The Polish ambassador was in the room, and he says, what are you talking about? You're accusing a representative of my country of lying. And Frankfurter says, no, Mr. Ambassador, I did not say that this young man is lying. I said that I'm unable to believe him. There is a difference. And then he waved his hands as if to make the unbelievable news disappear, and murmured to himself, no, and abruptly left the room. His burial, despite the lifelong avoidance of Judaism, he asked a former clerk to recite the Martyr's Kaddish. And he said, quote, I came into this world a Jew, and although I did not live my life entirely, interesting adverb, as a Jew, I think it is fitting that I should leave as a Jew. Arthur Goldberg, number 4. Okay, he is just, I love Arthur Goldberg. Just his stories are so relatable. Appointed by LBJ, 62. The press reached his mother-in-law and asked, isn't it wonderful? What is your thoughts about Arthur? And she says, wonderful, yes, but who cares about Arthur? Everybody knows something like this could happen to him, but that it should happen to me, that's more wonderful, that I'm the mother-in-law of a Supreme Court justice. His most notable decision was Escobedo, which is the precursor to Miranda, which is my law firm that I practiced my career at was responsible for Lewis and Rocha. He only served 3 years, and he left because he thought that if he took the position as the UN ambassador for LBJ, he could convince him to leave Vietnam. But he said, quote, my concern for justice, for peace, for enlightenment all stem from my heritage. He had hired only 8 clerks, 6 Jews, including 2 you might have heard of, Alan Dershowitz and Stephen Breyer. He was born in Chicago to Ukrainian Jewish immigrants active in communal life, often spoke at synagogues. When he was a sitting member of the Supreme Court, he spoke at a Honolulu synagogue, and he shared a story about his elderly mother, who he had recently met and was active in the Jewish community. And Goldberg was staying with her. He was visiting her, and he slept late, and the phone rang, and it was President of the United States, LBJ, and his mother answered, who's this? And the caller replied, this is the president. And the mother, Mrs. Goldberg, said, new president from which shul? So he was chairman of the board of overseers of the Jewish Theological Seminary, famous for his Passover Seders. The guest list in 1961 included JFK, Jackie, the Speaker of the House, several senators, 2 justices, and the president of the AFL-CIO. A lifelong Zionist, became the president of the AJC in late 60s, 1968, after leaving government. And he said in his speech, "I am proud of my Jewish heritage. I don't like any American who's not proud of his heritage." The link between, well, let me, all right. Next would be Fortis. There's not a whole lot to say about Fortis. Let's get to RBG. The 6th of 8, Clinton, 1994. 2 finalists for the position, both Jews, Breyer and Ginsburg. Clinton fell in love, that's what he said, with Ginsburg during their 90-minute interview. 24 years had elapsed from Fortis to Ginsburg. And now we have 3, almost 4, she sailed through confirmation, 96-3 vote. Born in Brooklyn, her family tried reform in Orthodox synagogues before finding a good fit at conservative East Midwood Jewish Center. She would wonder and asked her mom why a young girl, as a young girl, why boys got to do a bar mitzvah at age 13. Well, there was no comparable ceremony for me. A struggle that would shape much of her professional career. She was the camp rabbi at a Jewish camp, turned away from the Jewish religion when her mom died at 17. She asked about being a judge and a Jew. She says, quote, "I am a judge, born and raised and proud of being a Jew. My heritage as a Jew and my occupation as a judge fit together symmetrically. The demand for justice runs through the entirety of Jewish history and Jewish traditions. I take pride in and draw strength from my heritage." Okay, so everyone talks about on 3 walls, this is my chambers, by the way. On 3 walls of her chambers, she has the famous command from Deuteronomy, Zedek, Zedek, justice, justice, shalt thou pursue. I have it on 2, including that right behind me, Torah, and then on my, from the governor when I was appointed, my wife mounted it and framed it on that part of the Bible. So you can see on the back behind my appointment papers that. Her role models, 2 Jewish women, Emma Lazarus and Hadassah founder Henrietta Zoll. Now, she rejects any comparison between her appointment and these earlier appointments, explaining that Jews in the United States, I mean to convey, face few closed doors and do not fear letting the world know who we are. And then she asks, what is the difference between a New York City garment district bookkeeper and a U.S. Supreme Court justice? 1 generation of my life bears witness the difference between opportunities open to my mother, that bookkeeper, and those open to me. My wife said last night, I bet she was a smart bookkeeper. I mean, brilliant. But it just tells you. Last night I read this, and I was telling the folks beforehand, this is amazing. This is 13 years old, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a 13-year-old Ruth Bader Ginsburg, writing to her shul's monthly newsletter. Okay, I have a 13-year-old, doesn't write like this. Here's what she writes. It's about the Holocaust. The war has left a bloody trail, 13 years old, and many deep wounds not too easily healed. Many people have been left with scars that take a long time to pass away. We must never forget the horrors which our brethren were subjected to in Bergen-Belsen and other Nazi concentration camps. then too, we must try hard to understand that for religious people, hate and prejudice are neither good occupations nor fit companions. 13-year-old. In our beloved land, she turns to America, families were not scattered, communities not erased, nor our nation destroyed by the ravages of the World War. Yet dare we be at ease? No one can feel free from danger and destruction until the many torn threads of civilization are bound together again. Blew my mind. I think I said to my 13-year-old, like, why did you write like this? Okay, Stephen Breyer, not a whole lot. He doesn't have a very strong connection to Jews. His daughter is a very prominent Episcopal priest. He doesn't belong to a synagogue. But I did see an interview with him last night. He said, the most remarkable thing about there being 3 Jews on the US Supreme Court is how unremarkable it is. And last, Elena Kagan, born in Manhattan, appointed by Obama, belonged to an Orthodox synagogue as a child. And again, not happy that she was deprived the opportunity of a bat mitzvah while her brother, who she was very competitive with, received a bar mitzvah. So she cornered the rabbi, who is a very famous rabbi in Israel now, and conveyed her strong opinion that the synagogue should hold the ritual of bat mitzvahs, which are no less important than ritual bar mitzvahs. And they negotiated a solution. And so it was on a Friday night. It was called a bat Torah. She did the Haftorah, but not the Torah portion. The rabbi recounted, quote, this was really the first formal bat mitzvah I'd ever seen. So she was dean of Harvard Law, 6 years, very strong Jewish identity, belongs to a conservative synagogue, and that's it.
Yes, we have a question from Martin Lesner. If we can say a few words about Abe Fortas.
Sure. Okay. Abe Fortas was he was in the Jewish seat, right? He takes over from Goldberg. Goldberg goes to the UN, and so Fortas comes in. He was nominated by LBJ in 1965, same day that Goldberg was appointed and announced for the UN. He wasn't a proud Jew. For him, and this is a quote, Judaism would always remain an obstacle to be overcome rather than a heritage to be celebrated. Yet, it was due to a scholarship from a Memphis rabbi that he even attended college. And so if you think about what underlies our tradition of education, I think that's appropriate. He interestingly remained home on Yom Kippur, kind of like Sandy Koufax, and did not hear argument on that day, but not because of a personal sense of religious significance. It was only because his judicial assistant, and you know mine, insisted on it. Said he was the only Jewish justice, and you need to appear publicly observant. So that's what I had on Fortas.